In We Were Soldiers, every wounded man carried out of the Ia Drang Valley appears to have been hit by enemy fire, but the real valley held an enemy the camera could not easily show. During some operations in Ia Drang in the nearby Vinh San Valley, Army doctors found that as many as half of the participating personnel developed clinical malaria. The symptoms often waited 10 to 14 days. A man could complete the patrol, leave the jungle, and only then discover that the enemy had come home with him. By the end of 1965, malaria had become severe enough to render at least 2 American maneuver battalions ineffective without firing a shot. So how did an insect small enough to land unnoticed on a uniform do what enemy units sometimes could not? And why did the most advanced military medical system of its time struggle to stop it? Veterans returned from Vietnam with stories about snakes. One of the most famous was the so-called two-step snake, a name attached in veterans' accounts to an extremely venomous crate. The nickname came from the frightening claim that a bitten man would die after taking only 2 steps. That speed belonged to wartime folklore, but the fear was real. Snakes could enter defensive positions, cross trails, or appear where a soldier placed a hand in the dark. The snake was visible. It had a body, a head, and fangs. A man could warn the soldier behind him. The mosquito offered none of that certainty. Its bite could go unnoticed. The threat did not remain at the point of contact. It entered the blood, multiplied, and waited. By the time fever, violent chills, weakness, anemia, or neurological complications appeared, the mosquito was gone and the operation that caused the exposure might already be over. Army medical statistics reveal the scale of this hidden war. From 1965 through 1969, disease accounted for 69% of all U.S. Army hospital admissions in Vietnam. Battle injuries and wounds accounted for roughly 1 admission in 6. That does not mean disease killed more American soldiers than combat. It did not. A battle wound also tended to keep a man hospitalized much longer than most illnesses, but an army does not lose strength only when a soldier dies. It also loses strength when he cannot walk, patrol, carry ammunition, fly, repair an aircraft, or hold a perimeter. In one battalion operating in the Mekong Delta, 5 days in the rice paddies temporarily reduced effective strength by as much as 1/3 because of skin disease. Diarrheal illness was so often treated without formal hospitalization that Army historians concluded the official numbers captured only part of its effect. Among all these illnesses, malaria combined the worst features. It was common in the most dangerous operational areas. It could incapacitate a man for weeks, and its deadliest form was learning to resist the drugs used against it. From 1965 through 1970, the Army recorded 40,414 malaria cases in Vietnam. The question was no longer whether the jungle could remove soldiers from the fight. The question was whether commanders could predict where and when it would happen next. If you want the forgotten history behind the battles America remembers, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories. Because the next part of this fight began after the shooting stopped. In March and April of 1966, the 1st Cavalry Division gave Army medical officers something close to a battlefield experiment. The division conducted 3 operations in areas where falciparum malaria was widespread. Operation Jim Bowie in the Bong Son Valley, Operation Lincoln in the Ia Drang Valley, and Operation Lincoln in the Ia Drang Valley, and Operation Mosby in southwestern Kontum Province. The division's 1st and 3rd Brigades went into the high-risk operational areas. The 2nd Brigade remained closer to Highway 19 and the perimeter at An Khe, where mosquito control around the base reduced transmission. The difference did not appear immediately. Then, roughly 14 days after the midpoint of the operations, the cases began arriving. The 1st Brigade recorded 204 new malaria cases. The 3rd Brigade recorded 104. The 2nd Brigade, the one kept near the road and perimeter, recorded only 12 during the same period. The exposed brigades had not simply encountered more rain or endured a few uncomfortable nights. They had entered mountain and forest regions where infected mosquitoes were common and where the dangerous falciparum parasite circulated through local populations and enemy forces. The Central Highlands were especially dangerous because falciparum malaria was hyperendemic there. The mosquito population also changed with the weather. One vector became more common as the rainy season began, another bred effectively during heavier rainfall, and a third became more important as the rains declined. The risk did not arrive in one predictable wave and then disappear. Different mosquitoes could continue the transmission cycle as conditions changed. That helped explain another contrast in the Army records. Around cities, large towns, and established base camps with active insect control programs, very little malaria transmission occurred. Move the same soldiers into the mountains and forests beyond those protected areas, and the number of cases rose sharply. The difference was not simply Vietnam against America. It could be a matter of a few miles, a different mission, and several nights beyond the perimeter. The pattern repeated elsewhere. During Operation Paul Revere 4 in late 1966, a Special Forces Mobile Strike Force company recorded 5 malaria cases early enough that the infections must have been acquired before the operation. Then, 43 additional cases appeared. The first new case began 12 days after the company entered the exposure area. The last appeared 15 days after the company had left it. This was the delayed ambush. An enemy attack announced itself with gunfire. Malaria could wait until the unit had moved, reorganized, and begun preparing for another mission. The men who seemed healthy on the day they returned could become the next week's hospital admissions. For commanders, that delay created a planning nightmare. The strength written on a morning report did not necessarily represent the strength that would still be available 10 days later. Army medical officers began mapping malaria experience by region. They tracked climate, mosquito species, recent operations, enemy contact, and the performance of preventive programs. The 1st Cavalry Division surgeon compiled maps showing where cases had followed units from September 1965 through December 1966. The map could warn them where the parasite was likely to strike. It could not make infantrymen avoid the ground they had been ordered to enter. In 1967, soldiers with the military specialty 11B light weapons. Infantrymen represented only 15.3% of Army strength in Vietnam. They accounted for 58.5% of its malaria cases. The men who spent the most time outside control bases, moving through forest and highland terrain, were carrying a wildly disproportionate share of the medical burden. And American troops were not the only ones losing men. According to an account given to interrogators by one North Vietnamese officer, his company began with 120 men and lost 34 during a movement through the Central Highlands in 1965. 11, he said, were killed in action. 23 died from malaria. That report came from an interrogation and cannot be independently verified as a complete unit record. But blood tests offered separate evidence that the parasite was circulating among enemy forces. In one group of 12 captured North Vietnamese soldiers near Pleiku, 8 tested positive for falciparum malaria. Both armies tried to suppress it with pills. Captured North Vietnamese personnel described inconsistent supplies of quinine or other anti-malarial drugs. In this part of Vietnam, the enemy and the disease were not separate features of the battlefield. Infected people formed part of the reservoir. Mosquitoes moved the parasite between bodies. The closer American infantry moved toward active enemy areas in the highlands, the deeper it often moved into the transmission zone as well. But exposure alone does not explain why malaria nearly paralyzed units. The Army had anti-malarial drugs. It had years of experience from the Pacific in World War II and from Korea. The deeper problem was that the old medicine was beginning to fail. The first documented case of chloroquine-resistant falciparum malaria in an American serviceman appeared before the main U.S. buildup. The official medical history identifies the patient only as a 34-year-old Marine captain whose name is abbreviated in the record. In August 1962, after serving in Vietnam, he developed fever, muscle and joint pain, severe headaches, and shaking chills. A blood smear confirmed falciparum malaria. Doctors treated him with chloroquine, the drug that had become a standard answer to malaria. His fever disappeared. The parasites seemed to clear. He was released back to duty. Then he returned. In September, his temperature reached 105 degrees. He was pale and anemic, and his spleen had enlarged. The blood smear was positive again. Doctors administered another course of chloroquine. Once more, the symptoms receded. Then the parasite returned a third time. Within 6 weeks, the captain had suffered 3 attacks from what appeared to be the same infection. Chloroquine was suppressing it, not eliminating it. He was transferred to the Naval Hospital at Great Lakes, Illinois, where a combination of quinine and pyrimethamine finally produced a cure. Researchers preserved and studied the resistant parasite. It became known as the Vietnam Cestane strain, using the abbreviation assigned to the patient. The case was an early warning. By 1965, it had become an operational emergency. Army physicians reviewing the early experience found that nearly all the clinical infections were falciparum malaria. Most showed resistance to chloroquine. In one analysis, 70% of infections in non-immune patients responded only partially to chloroquine, returning within 1 to 4 weeks. Between 10 and 20% did not respond adequately even to a second course. Quinine could stop the acute attack more reliably, but it did not guarantee a final cure. Some regimens produced recrudescence rates of 70 to 90% within a month. At Tripler General Hospital in Hawaii, 286 malaria patients arrived from Vietnam in just 2 months near the end of 1965. Before reaching Tripler, those men had collectively received 11 different individual or combined treatment schedules. When doctors initially used the familiar chloroquine regimen, 70 of 163 patients relapsed, a failure rate of 43%. At Camp Zama in Japan, an analysis of 426 falciparum patients found an 89% recrudescence rate 1 month after the standard 3-day chloroquine treatment. The problem was no longer simply getting medicine to the battlefield. The parasite had made the most familiar medicine unreliable. Every apparent cure now carried another question: had the infection actually disappeared, or had it only retreated beyond the reach of the blood smear? That temporary success made resistance particularly dangerous. A treatment that failed immediately could be replaced. A treatment that lowered the fever, cleared the visible parasites, and returned a man to duty appeared to have worked until the same patient came back weeks later. Each relapse created more than another hospital admission. It meant the Army could not confidently predict how long a treated soldier would remain available. It also meant medical officers had to distinguish a new infection from the return of an old one, often while men were moving between Vietnam, Japan, Hawaii, and the continental United States. The Army needed a new combination, and it needed to test that combination among men who were still entering the same forests where the resistant parasite was spreading. Those same forests had already witnessed the ambush near Landing Zone Albany, where 155 American soldiers were killed in the battle. We were soldiers left out. We reconstructed that forgotten fight in the video linked on your screen. But first, this story continues with another battle in Ia Drang, one fought not with bullets, but with medicine. On August 6, 1965, senior Army medical officials met to assess the growing threat. The Surgeon General warned General Creighton Abrams and the medical command in Vietnam that malaria discipline, drug prophylaxis, and officer training had become matters of combat effectiveness. Researchers turned their attention to Dapsone. Dapsone had been used to treat leprosy, and laboratory work suggested that a small daily dose could suppress chloroquine-resistant falciparum malaria when added to the weekly chloroquine-primaquine tablet already issued to troops. The first small trial began with 1st Cavalry personnel in early 1966. Then came a larger test under conditions no laboratory could reproduce. 12 companies from the division's 1st Brigade deployed west of Pleiku in the Central Highlands. Soldiers in the study group received 25 milligrams of Dapsone each day, plus the standard weekly anti-malarial tablet. 6 companies served as controls. The companies taking Dapsone experienced roughly 50% less malaria. A second comparison followed during Operation Paul Revere 1 in the Ia Drang and Ya Lop River valleys near the Cambodian border. Most of the task force received daily Dapsone. 2 battalions from the 1st Cavalry did not. When hospital records were reviewed over the next 2 months, malaria incidence among the troops taking Dapsone was 1/10 the incidence observed in the units not taking it. The comparison was not perfect. The groups came from different divisions, and researchers could not control every use of repellent, long sleeves, or other preventative measures. But in a war where commanders had watched malaria remove entire formations from effective service, the difference was too large to ignore. By July 1966, Army commands received new instructions. Troops at high risk from resistant falciparum malaria would add daily Dapsone to their weekly tablet. Treatment became a multi-drug campaign: quinine to attack the acute infection, pyrimethamine and Dapsone to improve the chance that the parasite would not return, and continued observation to detect failure. The Army had found a weapon that worked. But it worked only if the right men received it, took it on schedule, and continued taking it when the immediate danger no longer felt real. That transformed malaria prevention from a medical recommendation into a command problem. Around major bases and cities, Army insect control programs kept malaria transmission relatively low. Preventive teams reduced breeding areas, sprayed insecticides, and helped create protected spaces that did not exist in the forest. Outside those bases, protection depended on small, repetitive actions: use repellent, cover exposed skin, sleep under netting when possible, and take the prescribed tablets on time. The Army called it malaria discipline. Some units maintained a roster. On the assigned day, men swallowed the weekly tablet as they approached the mess line. The purpose was not ceremony. It was supervision. The standard weekly combination was effective against Vivax malaria when taken regularly, but it was much less useful against the resistant falciparum strain in Southeast Asia, which was why high-risk units also needed daily Dapsone. The system looked simple on paper. In the field, every part of it could break. Repellent wore away. Long sleeves were difficult in tropical heat. Nets were not always practical during mobile operations. A daily drug could be interrupted when a man went on rest and recuperation leave. Medical officers discovered that even a short break in Dapsone prophylaxis could allow falciparum malaria to break through. The weekly tablet created another problem. Gastrointestinal effects were common enough that some soldiers reported diarrhea within 24 hours, an especially unwelcome consequence during a combat operation. Other complaints included insomnia, although Army doctors found that symptom difficult to evaluate. Severe reactions were rare, but they were not imaginary. The drugs could cause dangerous blood reactions in susceptible individuals, and isolated allergic emergencies were recorded. For an infantryman, the choice did not feel like a clean comparison between medicine and disease. One consequence could appear the next morning. The other might remain invisible for 2 weeks. That made supervision essential. It also made the moment of returning home unexpectedly dangerous. Soldiers leaving Vietnam were instructed to continue weekly medication for 8 weeks so that dormant Vivax infections would not emerge later. But once a veteran had left the unit, the malaria roster and the officer watching the mess line disappeared. At Letterman Army Hospital in San Francisco, doctors reviewed 29 patients with Vivax malaria after Vietnam. Not one had completed the full 8-week regimen or continued it until symptoms appeared. A larger survey of 671 asymptomatic Vietnam veterans reached the same conclusion. 70% had failed to complete their prescribed course after returning to the United States. Even previous illness did not guarantee compliance. Among the veterans who had experienced clinical malaria in Vietnam, 76% still failed to finish the medication after coming home. The result was a second delayed wave. In 1965, the United States and Puerto Rico recorded 156 malaria cases. By 1970, the number had reached 3,997. Military personnel and recently discharged veterans accounted for almost all of that increase. At Fort Bragg in 1967, 3,544 malaria cases appeared. Of those, 274 involved members of the 82nd Airborne Division. They cost the division 35-2 2nd Airborne Division. They cost the division 30-36 lost duty days. The soldiers had left Vietnam. The infection had not. And just as the Army seemed to be gaining control through Dapsone and standardized treatment, the medical weapon produced its own deadly reversal. By 1969, large numbers of troops had taken Dapsone without a catastrophic reaction. There was growing interest in expanding its use. Then Army hospitals identified 16 soldiers who had developed agranulocytosis while taking Dapsone prophylaxis. The condition destroys the body's ability to produce enough of the white blood cells needed to fight infection. 8 of the 16 men died from overwhelming sepsis. The risk was rare, but the consequence was severe enough to change policy. Dapsone would no longer be required across the force. Commanders could authorize it when medical officers judged the malaria exposure high enough to cause unacceptable manpower losses. The drug had reduced malaria dramatically in field trials. It had also killed men it was intended to protect. This was the central difficulty of the medical war in Vietnam. Every solution altered the battlefield. Chloroquine had been dependable until falciparum malaria became resistant. Quinine worked, but long oral courses caused nausea and vomiting, and the infection could still return. Dapsone suppressed resistant malaria but required constant discipline and carried a small risk of catastrophic toxicity. Shortening treatment could return soldiers to duty sooner, but one 7-day experiment produced a failure rate of about 6%. Keeping men on medication longer increased drug exposure and hospital time. Even the parasite did not remain still. By early 1970, doctors at the 6th Convalescent Center reviewed 792 falciparum patients treated with the regimen that had served since 1966. The recrudescence rate had climbed to 9.6%. When patients who had already relapsed were treated again with the standard oral program, only 33% were cured. Intravenous quinine cured 89%. Some infections resisted even the rigorous intravenous approach. Those patients had to be evacuated to Walter Reed Army Medical Center and treated with experimental drugs from the Army Malaria Research Program. In other words, the Army was not moving steadily from ignorance to victory. It was fighting an arms race against a living organism. But the statistics also show something remarkable. The medical system adapted quickly enough to prevent operational disaster from becoming mass death. The American medical response did not depend on one miracle drug. It depended on a chain. Field medics recognized fever and moved patients. Laboratories confirmed parasites through blood smears. Evacuation hospitals treated acute cases. Original blood slides traveled with patients so that doctors farther along the system could check the diagnosis and identify mixed infections or relapses. Researchers compared drug combinations, dosages, and treatment length while the war was still underway. When higher quinine doses caused frequent nausea and vomiting without improving recovery, the dosage was reduced. When a 14-day quinine course appeared longer than necessary, doctors compared it with a 10-day course in 141 patients. Neither group recorded a treatment failure during the observation period, and the shorter course reduced hospitalization by 3 days. The 85th Evacuation Hospital at Key Nome became one of the centers of that work. From September 1966 through August 1967, malaria accounted for 35% of all its medical admissions. 3/4 of those malaria cases were falciparum. Under the standardized multi-drug regimen, the short-term recrudescence rate fell below 1% in that series, and no deaths were recorded. But clearing the parasites was not the same as returning an infantryman to combat condition. Falciparum malaria could leave a man weak and anemic after his fever had broken. He needed time to rebuild strength without occupying an evacuation hospital bed needed for new casualties. That was the purpose of the 6th Convalescent Center at Cam Ranch Bay. The center opened in 1966 under a 30-day theater evacuation policy. Patients expected to recover within a month could remain in Vietnam instead of being sent farther along the evacuation chain. Malaria patients made up roughly 50 to 65% of its population. The center handled an average of more than 1,000 patients each month. Men completed treatment, recovered, and entered a graduated physical conditioning program. 96% returned to duty. That was the equivalent of restoring 1 or 2 battalions to the force every month. Treatment also became faster. In 1965, a falciparum malaria patient could lose approximately 5 weeks from duty. By 1969, improved therapy had reduced that period to roughly 17 to 19 days. The parasite never became harmless. It continued to resist, relapse, and follow men home. But across the 6 years from 1965 through 1970, the Army recorded 40,414 malaria cases and 78 deaths. Every one of those deaths mattered. The ratio, however, shows what the hospitals, laboratories, preventative medicine teams, and field commanders achieved. Malaria repeatedly threatened combat strength, but modern treatment prevented tens of thousands of infections from becoming tens of thousands of fatalities. This was not the kind of victory marked by captured ground. It was measured in men who walked out of a convalescent center and returned to their units. The medical fight did not end when a patient left the hospital. When a particularly resistant infection survived a rigorous treatment program, the patient could be evacuated to Walter Reed. Researchers isolated the strain and tested it against experimental compounds. The parasite that had defeated medicine in a jungle operation became evidence in the search for the next drug. By 1970 and 1971, the Army was testing new classes of anti-malarial compounds against infections acquired in Vietnam. The drugs carried code numbers because many had not yet become finished medicines. One experimental compound produced radical cures in 23 of 25 acute falciparum cases. Another cured 23 of 26 patients in Vietnam and 8 more who had suffered repeated recrudescences after returning to the United States. Those experiments did not produce a single final answer. Some drugs that worked in controlled volunteer studies performed less impressively in natural battlefield infections. Others created new questions about toxicity, dosage, or the speed at which resistance might develop. But Vietnam had forced the Army to build something more durable than one treatment schedule. A continuing malaria research program capable of moving information from the field to the hospital, from the hospital to the laboratory, and then back toward the field. The official medical history reached a sober conclusion. There would probably never be a final chapter in malaria, chemotherapy only, an ongoing contest between new knowledge and new resistance. That may be the most important consequence of the invisible battle. The Army did not defeat malaria in Vietnam. It learned how dangerous it was to believe malaria had already been defeated. We Were Soldiers tells the story of a battle measured in hours and days. The men land, the enemy closes around them, helicopters flying to the fire, the survivors leave the valley. That is where a war film naturally ends. Malaria operated outside that frame. Its most revealing numbers appeared after an operation, when the gunfire had stopped and the unit had moved somewhere else. Its casualties often carried no visible wound. Its enemy could not be photographed standing over the ground it had taken. The movie did not invent the terror of Ia Drang, and it did not owe the audience a medical history of every disease in the Central Highlands. But the Army records change what the valley means. Ia Drang was not only a place where American and North Vietnamese soldiers learned how they would fight each other, it was also part of the region where American medicine confronted a drug-resistant parasite on an operational scale. The 1st Cavalry did not leave that enemy behind when the helicopters lifted off. It appeared in hospital admissions 2 weeks later. It forced commanders to count future illness before planning the next mission. It turned infantry companies into field trials. It followed veterans to Fort Bragg, San Francisco, and hospitals across the United States. The snakes became the stories soldiers told because a snake could be seen. The mosquito became a line in a medical report because its attack was quiet, delayed, and repeated tens of thousands of times. But the smallest enemy in the jungle forced one of the largest medical responses of the war. It never fired a shot. It never held a hill. And yet, for thousands of American soldiers, the hardest part of surviving the jungle began only after the patrol was over. To see the deadly 7th Cavalry ambush that We Were Soldiers left out, continue with the next Forgotten War Stories episode on screen.